I've done it.
I did it. Baruch Hashem. Okay, tonight we're learning Maseches Sanhedrin Daf Nun. And as you'll recall from the beginning of the Perek, and we'll just look back up at the Mishnah at the beginning of Arba Misos Bez Nimsaru, is that there's a machlokes between the Tanakama and Reb Shimon. The Tanakama holds that the rank of capital punishments is skila, sreifa, hereg, and chenek. And in fact, that's kind of the lashon of Bnei Torah. Skila, sreifa, hereg, and chenek. That's like if you say, what are the Arba, that's kind of what we would rattle off. Masha ein kain, Reb Shimon holds sreifa, skila, chenek, and hereg. And what we're going to be doing for about 80% of our learning today is figuring out how the Tanakama got his ranking of skila, sreifa, hereg, and chenek, and how Reb Shimon got his ranking of sreifa, skila, chenek, and hereg. Now, I want to just be clear. This Gemara is not difficult. However, the same svaras are being used in different ways. The same rationales are being used in different ways, and that sometimes is difficult when you're not learning iyun. You're learning iyun, you have time to ponder all of the minutiae, but we don't really have time for that, obviously. So we're going to get started 3 lines from the bottom of Mem Testament base, and we'll be heading down to the third long line on Nun Amud Beis. One housekeeping note, I know I just got back, but I'm not here tomorrow night. I already got Rabbi Handler to sub for me. I have an event that I have to go to. Okay, says the Gemara 3 lines from the bottom on Mem Testament base, skila, sreifa, hereg, and chenek. Remember, that was the Tanakama's ruling. But let's figure out all of the reasons why the Tanakama holds the way that he does. So says the Gemara, skila chamura misreifa. Remember, skila sreifa. So how do we know that skila is more chamur than sreifa? Sheken nitna lemegade fula oved avodas gilulim. Because who do we give skila to? We give it to the worst offenders. It's the people who are not the ones in Gen Pop. These are the guys who do the horrible things. And my chumra, what is the uniquely horrible thing about the megadef and the oved avodas gilulim, my chumra? Shekain poshet yado beikar. Because this person has extended his hand on the ikar. What does this mean? It means that he's missing something super fundamental. He's rejecting a Kadosh Baruch Hu. So obviously, that's the Gemara svar, that therefore the person should have the most severe of all of the punishments, which is skila. Says the Gemara, well, hold on one second. Adarabba, I could have argued that perhaps sreifa chamura, because she came in the bas kohen shezinsa. A bas kohen who is mizana, so she gets sreifa. This is an odd argument, right? You have someone who doesn't believe in a Kadosh Baruch Hu and he gets skila, and then you have Bas Kohen Shezinsa, who, for all intents and purposes, there's the Yetzer Hara for inappropriateness, for licentiousness. My chumrah, why is this worse? So the Gemara gives, again, we just don't have time to go into all the minutiae, but it is fascinating. The Gemara says, because she doesn't only disgrace herself, she's also disgracing her father. Rashi points out what? Yeah, fascinating Rashi at the bottom. Bottom line, and the Gemara says that because the Kohen, her father, is treated this way, the Gemara assumes in the question that that's worse than being Megadef.
She messes up 2 people.
So,
in this count, one person. It's not as bad as Megadef, but
it's just hard to imagine that being Kofar Be'ikr is second to the Mizana, who also affects her father.
She's messing up 2 people, herself and her father. The other guy gets skila, it's only himself.
It's like making a heckish between the Kadosh Baruch Hu and Kohen.
No, but but skila, but on the capital punishment side, only the daughter gets the capital punishment.
But she messes up.
She messes up 2 people, but the application is still only.
You know her sin is bad because she messes up 2 people. So therefore,
Es aviha hi michaleles.
Is bigger.
The pasuk in Chumash, es aviha hi michaleles ba'ish tisaref. She gets burned.
Right. No, it's not that 2 people get burned.
Right. Correct.
Aish must be more chomer because it goes to a person who messes up 2 people. That's the svara. Again, if you're asking me, I don't think it comes close to
I know.
But
correct.
That's the tzad.
Right. So how does the Gemara answer this? We asked our question. Again, the Havamim is difficult for us, but perhaps Sreifa is chamor because of Bas Kohen Shizin. So says the Gemara, turning to the top of Nun Amud Aleph, Kasabre Rabbanon, the rabbis in our Mishnah hold, and therefore the reason why in our Mishnah they hold skila is more chamor than sreifa, even though there's a svara by the Bas Kohen Shezinsa that it should be more chamor than skila, because the rabbis hold nesua yotze l'sreifa. When we talk about a Bas Kohen who gets sreifa, that's only if the daughter is married, below arusa. But if she had only been betrothed, the daughter who was mizana, so then that's different and she gets a different punishment. And because we changed the halacha for an arusa as it relates to a Bas Kohen Shezinsa, that she only gets skila, quote unquote, only, shma mina, skila chamura. We see here that it's actually the opposite. What did we say? When does the din of Ba'esh Tisaref apply? Only if she's married. That's the scope of the din Ba'esh Tisaref, by a Kohen Shezinsa, Bas Kohen Shezinsa. So then when we default for the Arusa back to Skila, what does that show? Shma mina skila chamur. And this is the svara that we accept for the Tanakama as to why we say Skila Sreifa. Now, Skila Chamura Misayif, let's go back down, which said Skila Sreifa Hereg, which is Saif, and Chenek. So it says the Gemara, how do we know that Skila is Chamur? You proved yourself with Skila and Sreifa. Got it, Tanakama. But Skila Chamur Misayif, how do you know? Shekain Nitna Lemagadev Ula Oved Avodas Kochavim, similar like we saw before. The language shifts. It used to be Avodas Gilulim, and now it shifts to Avodas Kochavim. As you know from, I know my brother taught this stuff about Yeshu, that there's a lot of censoring that happened here. Avodas Gilulim, Avodas Kochavim. So these are just some very small minutia. No halachic nafkamina, to my knowledge, between the two languages. But perhaps we should say that skila is more chamor than saif because skila is given out to the criminals who reject HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Umay chumra. What's the uniqueness of how bad the megadif is? Kida amran, like we said earlier, which is that they're poshet yado be'ikr. So that, says the Gemara, is the baseline svara for how we know that skila is chamor misayif. So the Gemara asks, not so pashut. Adarabba, saif chamor. I could argue that hereg, that saif is more strict than skila. Shekei nitan la'anshe ir hanidachas. Because when we are punishing a city's worth of people who have done something very wrong, right? They're an ir hanidachas. Umay chumra, what is unique about an ir hanidachas? Shekain mamonan avad, everything in the city gets destroyed. Oh, so here we see apples to apples, right? We have the case scenario of megadef, and we have the ir hanidachas, except that the ir hanidachas has a unique chumra that applies to it, which is it's avad mamonan as well. So here the Gemara says, flip things on its head. You wanted to say skila is more chumra than saif, but because of ir hanidachas, I could tell you that saif is more chamor than skila. Kasha on the Tanakama. Amris, the Gemara says, don't worry. Eze koach meruba. Which of the following is worse? Koach ha-madiach or koach ha-nidach? The power, literally, or the impact of someone who causes someone else to go off the derech, koach ha-nidach, or the one who was pushed off the derech. Have'omar koach ha-madiach. Vitanya, madiche ir hanidachas beskila. And what we see is that the madiche ir hanidachas, those who pushed people off, they caused for the ir hanidachas, higher level, skila. We therefore see skila is a higher level than sreifa, and that is the second box that we will check. Next, about 10 lines down, we did skila, sreifa, and then hereg, which is saif. Now we're going to talk about skila and chenek. Skila chamura mechenek, how do we know? Because shekei nitan the megadif ul oved avodas kochavim. Because, as we've already pointed out, skila is given out to those who don't believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Let's just be clear. We're not talking about today's Amaratzim. That's not, we don't qualify as not being ma'aminim. The people today who don't believe are tinokos shenishba. And according to some poskim, and this is very controversial, even if you grew up in a firm home, you might still be a tinok shenishba. It's a very fascinating idea because it depends what your level of Havana. You can't be a kofar unless you know. You have to know. But if you don't really know, like, I know my new job is, I'm saying, but if you go through the system, are you now no longer shaykh to Tinok Shenishba? This is discussed in poskim as it relates to the status of Tinok Shenishba. So the Gemara says, Skila chamura mechenek, because of Megadev. Umay chumra, what was unique about Skila and the Megadev, Kide Amran, that we said that this person is poshet yado be'ikr, and therefore it suggests the Gemara, according to the Tanakhama in our Mishnah, that Skila is chamura mechenek. Asks the Gemara, Adarabba, perhaps it's not that way at all. Perhaps chenek is chamur, shekein nitan lemake aviv ve'imo. Wow. This is, my children need to see this Gemara. This Gemara is about Kibud Avayim. Look what this Gemara says. The Gemara says, no, Chenek is more chamor than Skila, because when a person is Make Avi V'imo, they get Chenek. Umay Chumra. What is the Chumra, the uniqueness about Kibud Avayim? Shekain Hukash Kvodan L'Kvod HaMakom. That the kavod of parents is obviously, Kaviyachal in certain ways, similar to the kavod of Shemayim. This is based on Psukim Kabed Sabicha Vesimecha and the pasuk of Kabed Das Honcha, where we see the language of Kabed is applied in a similar syntax, both for parents and for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Gemara says, therefore, because we give chenek by Kibud Avayim, that's more chamor than Poshet Yado Be'ikr. Again, a very powerful Havamina, one that I will go home and tell my children. So the Gemara says, no, don't worry about it. It's not the case. We don't say chenek is more chamor than skila. We still say skila is more chamor than chenek. Third of the way down. How do we know? Mida'afke rachmana le'arusa bas Yisrael. Because when we were talking about a betrothed Yisrael girl, Michlal Nesua Bas Yisrael Mechenek Leskila, there's a difference between an Arusa and a Nesua, and that Arusa is dropped is changed from Chenek to Skila, Shmamina Skila Chamura, and that ends our third mini sugya. We've now proved, according to the Tanakhama, that Skila is bigger than Sreifa. We've proved that Skila is bigger than Hereg, and we just proved that Skila is bigger than Chenek. Now, as we move down the line to be super thorough with the sheet of the Tanakhama, we explained how Skila is greater than all the others. But how do we know, says the Gemara, that Sreifa is Chamura Misayif? How do we know that Sreifa, that burning, is more of a Chamor capital punishment than Saif? Shekein nitna lebas kohen shezinsa, as pointed out, that a woman who is mezana when she's a bas kohen, she gets killed with Sreifa. Umay Chumra. What was the uniquely horrible thing that the Bas Kohen did? She's already doing horrible activities of licentiousness. So what's unique that happens even if you're not a Bas Kohen? So what's the chiddush of her? So it says the Gemara, that was what we saw in the bottom of the previous page. Ayin Rashi Sham, for the same ideas of how she, and David, the way you put it is fascinating, that she's impacting two people. She's not just hurting herself and her neshama and her guf, but she's also trashed her father's reputation. It's not good. Even in the pasuk, the way the pasuk is formulated is around what she did to him. It's a very weird formulation. I don't know where else. Unless it's a Ben Adam Lachavero Dikadin, then it's different. That's not Ben Adam Lachavero. Because she didn't do anything to him.
Right.
It's not like Kibud Avayim, you hurt your father,
Right.
So then I understand that it wasn't directed. No, she slept with someone she shouldn't. But it impacted him.
Very interesting.
I wonder how mechudash. Ki sechel liznos. Leish tisar.
In the first word.
That's the only reason I know half the pasuk. So says the Gemara, perhaps Sreifa is chamura because she impacted her father. Says the Gemara, Adarabba, I could argue the exact opposite than the Tanakhama, that perhaps Saif is chamur, shekein nitan la'an she'yer nitacha, so my chomer shekein mamonon avad. Maybe there's a chiddush in Saif, and maybe Saif is worse. Says the Gemara, don't worry, ne'emar avia b'skila, v'ne'emar avia b'sreifa. We have a pasuk by skila where it says the word avia, and it says it the same thing by sreifa. Ma avia amor b'skila, skila chamor misayif. Just like when the pasuk says avia, in regards to skila, it says avia, and there skila is more chamor. Af avia amor b'sreifa, sreifa chamura misayif. And this answers our fourth box, our fourth question. These are questions that aren't being asked. It's just a very thorough process of figuring out exactly the pecking order of why it is that the Tanna Kama says Skila, Sreifa, Harag, and Chenek in that order. Very dafka. Now let's go to the fifth iteration, which is another Sreifa issue. Sreifa Chamura Mechenek. We should assume, like the Tanna Kama says, that Sreifa is Chamura Mechenek Shekin Nitna Labas Kohen Shezinta, as mentioned many times over, that the daughter did something wrong to her father, and she gets Sreifa. That she damaged her father. The language of the Gemara was Sheken Mechaleles Esavia. Just thinking another problem with that pasuk. She's Mechaleles her father, but isn't the Chalal the exact opposite, where the father,
In the sense of a color.
in the sense of a Chalal? All this is very
It
weird.
just makes him cool. Think of it that way, it makes him. Cool.
Yeah,
Which is sort of
right.
What that Rashi says.
Right, that was what the
He was
Rashi said.
special, and now he's cool.
So it's just the directionality is reversed.
I'm
Yeah,
fascinated at your point.
yeah.
That possible.
Right. It's very weird. And this is another language that's pushing in that direction of child to father who's a Kohen, instead of what we would normally say is that the father messed up and now the child is a Chalal. Okay. It says the Gemara, maybe we should assume Sreifa is Chamor Mechenek. Says the Gemara, Adarabba, Chenek Chamor Shekein Nitan Lemake Avi V'imo. No, maybe Chenek is more Chamor because Chenek applies to a child who beats his father. Umay Chomer Shekein Hukash Kvodan. That perhaps we should say that Kibbut Avayim is punished with chenek because parents are equated, again, kaviyachol, in some way to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Says the Gemara, how do we answer this question? Maybe this is a kasha in the Tanna Kama. The Gemara says 2/3 of the way down, 10 lines before the wide lines. No. Midafke rachmana l'nesua bas kohen, michlal nesua bas Yisrael, mechenek l'sreifa. When a nesua bas kohen leaves the general rules of chenek and becomes a sreifa, as opposed to a bas Yisrael who would have chenek, shmamina sreifa chamura, we see that it's chamur. And now we've answered 5 out of 6 iterations of how to unpack the shita of the Tanna Kama. Let's learn the 6th and final one before we move over to the shita of Reb Shimon in our Mishnah. And the Gemara says, Seifa chamur mechenek, Saif, is chamur mechenek, being killed by the sword is more severe of a capital punishment than chenek. Shekein nitan la'anshe ir hanidachas, as mentioned. Saif was the punishment by ir hanidachas. Umay chumra. What was the uniquely bad aspect of the ir hanidachas? Shekein mamon on avad, that their finances, their properties were also destroyed. So therefore, maybe we should say, like the Tanna Kama, that Saif is chamur mechenek. Says the Gemara, no, adarabba, I disagree with you. Or at least let me ask you a question. We should possibly say that chenek is chamur from Saif. There is a uniqueness, a chiddushdik idea to the word chenek, because chenek applies to make avi v'imo. So maybe chenek is more severe than sayiv. Says Gemara, filu hachi poshed yato beikar adif. No, and the Gemara lays down the law. When you have on the scales of justice the two things of poshet yado beikar, you have a yid who says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I don't believe in you anymore, and I'm going to be megadef, and I'm going to be worth. Poshet yado beikar is worse than the lack of kibbut av, I should say, make avi v'imo. Lack of kibbut avim, everybody has, but make avi v'imo, it's still the other one's heavier. That makes sense to us. If your mom is shakofar beikar, that's bottom of the barrel. You hit your dad, you have anger management problems. Those are different sugyas. Mental health over here, and real philosophical, theological challenges over there. No.
Kadosh Baruch Hu forgives, of errors against him, no problem. But not until we're maratze our chaver.
That's beautiful. That explains the havamina of the Gemara, just not the conclusion. Meaning the Gemara's conclusion is that poshet yodo beikar is worse.
There's nothing bad.
Right, it's just so fundamental. It reminds me of the machlokas, the Rambam and the Ramban, if the first of the Aseres Adibros is a mitzvah or not.
No.
And the Ramban holds too basic. You can't, if you don't pour a foundation, you don't have a house. So you don't believe Anochi Hashem Elokecha Asher Tzeitzich Merit Mitzrayim, you're a zero. It's not a mitzvah. It's a precursor to mitzvahs. That's what the Ramban holds. So it seems from the Gemara over here, that the Havamin is like Utex, but the conclusion is that when we put them on the scales of justice, it has to be the case that Poshet Yado Be'ikr is worse than Make Aviv Imo, and therefore Saif is worse than Chenek. Good. We're right now two dots before the wide lines, 2 lines before the wide lines as well. And let's just review what we are about to learn. Look back in the Mishnah on the top of Mem Testament Beis. Let's look at Reb Shimon's Shita. He says it's not skila sreifa hereg and chenek. It's sreifa skila chenek hereg. So the pairs of them switch. That's actually how you would remember it. Skila sreifa, no, sreifa skila. And then hereg chenek, no, chenek and hereg. So he inverts each of the pairs, the dyads, even though it's not really built that way. We'll see soon that that's just not what was going on in his head. But that's an easier way to remember it. So let's dig in a very similar form, which what makes this Gemara easier to learn in a way, because we've been seeing the same type of pattern over the last Amud. So Reb Shimon Omer v'chule sreifa chamor miskila. How do we know? Shekein nitna lebas kohen shezinsa, that we know that we give sreifa to a bas kohen. Umay chumra shekein mechalel esavia. So baseline, like we saw before, that the bas kohen shezinsa gets sreifa, and lechora that's worse than skila. Asks the Gemara, Adarabba, skila chamura shekein nitna lemegadiv ulaoved avodas kochavim. Umay chumra shekein poshed yado be'ikr. So says the Gemara, it must be in the Havamina at least. The Gemara is asking that skila must be chamura because it's given to the megadef, and that's poshet yado be'ikr. So on the justice scales, we're holding up on the one side poshet yado be'ikr, and on the other side of bas kohen shezinsa. Now, I'm balabas, but I would have thought, like we saw at the end of the sheet of the Tanakama, that poshet yado be'ikr is worse than bas kohen shezinsa. So the Gemara says, Reb Shimon l'taime, the Amar achas arusa ve'achas nesua yatsu l'sreifa. He says they both have the same din. At the very top of this page, the Rabbanan made a distinction between an arusa and a nesua. The Rabbanan were of the opinion that the nesua gets sreifa, but an arusa gets skila. And that was why we ended up saying earlier that skila is more powerful than sreifa, because the arusa gets skila. But according to the shita of Reb Shimon, even an arusa gets sreifa. And therefore, the svara that allowed for the Rabbanan to say skila is more powerful than sreifa doesn't apply according to Reb Shimon. Umida'afke rachmana le'arusa bas kohen michlal arusa bas Yisrael miskila l'sreifa. Once we moved over a bas kohen who was mizana into the category of sreifa, shma mina sreifa chamura. So when we look at our Mishnah at the beginning of the Perek, and we see the Tanakama says skila is more chamur than sreifa, and according to the Reb Shimon, it's the opposite. Sreifa is more chamur than skila. That's because they argue about the arusa bas kohen shezinsa. According to the arusa bas kohen shezinsa, according to the Tanakama, she gets skila. But according to Reb Shimon, no, she doesn't. According to Reb Shimon, she gets sreifa. And that's the determining factor of whether or not skila and sreifa, which one is more chamor. So the machlokas over here about the arusa bas kohen explains the machlokas in our Mishnah between the Tanakama and Reb Shimon about whether or not skila is more chamor than sreifa, or if sreifa is more chamor than skila. Where are we? Here we go. Sreifa chamura misayif, 3 lines from the bottom, says the Gemara in the name of Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon held that sreifa was more chamor than saif. How do we know? Shekain nitna lebas kohen shezinsa, because the bas kohen shezinsa gets sreifa. Umay chumra kede amron. What was the unique, horrible thing that she did is that she was mechalel her father. So therefore, maybe sreifa is more chamor than saif. Adarabba, says the Gemara. Perhaps it's not that way at all. Perhaps saif chamor. Perhaps the capital punishment of saif is worse. Shekain nitan la'anche ir nidachas umay chomer shekain mamonam avad. What are the 2 things we're putting on the scale? We are putting bas kohen shezinsa on one side of the scale, and the fact that there's mamonan avad on the other side of the scale by ir nidachas. And this is the Gemara's question. You wanted to say that sreifa is chamor misayif. Perhaps saif is chamor misreifa. So the Gemara answers, No. Amris, what would you say? Bottom line. V'chi eze koach meruba. Again, similar language as before. Which one's worse? Koach ha-madiach or koach ha-nidach? The one who causes for others to go off the path, or the one who is pushed off the path, the victim. So the Gemara says on the top of Daf Nun Amud Beis, as we turn to the top of the next Amud, and we're going to be learning until about 10 lines from the bottom of the page, Aviyomer koach ha-madiach, that the one who causes others to go off the path is worse. And says the Gemara, explaining itself, V'kal v'chomer, Uma chenek shechamor misayif, just like chenek, strangulation, is worse than sayif, sreifa chamura mimenu, and even though chenek is more chamor than sayif, sreifa is more chamor than chenek, sayif hakal lo kol shekain, sayif, which is less than chenek, if A is equal to B, and B is equal to C, okay, we know how to do the math. So that's what the Gemara says, and that we therefore accept this explanation of the Gemara in the name of Reb Shimon, that Sreifa is more chamor than Saif based on this Kal v'chomer. So let's keep pounding through the Shita of Reb Shimon, and we're on Nun Amud Beis. Says the Gemara, Skila chamura mechenek. Stoning is more stringent than chenek. Shekain nitna lemegadev uleoved avodas kochavim. Because in these cases, the Gemara says that why is skila worse? Because skila is given out to the worst criminals who are poshet yado, umay chumra keda'amran, that they're poshet yado be'ikr. So therefore, the havamina is, or I should say, we know that this is the conclusion too. The Mishnah says skila is chamor mechanek. It says the Gemara, maybe not. Adirabba, perhaps we should argue the exact opposite. That chenek is chamor. Perhaps chenek is more chamor than skila. Shekein nitan lemaka avi v'imo umay chumra shekein hukash. Maybe we should say that chenek, which is doled out to a child who physically harms his father, all the shilas about giving your father injections, and if a person has to do CPR on their father, and it causes for bruising, obviously it's pikuach nefashos, it overrides, but it's easier. It's easier, right? There, whatever the case may be, to be the doctor, to be a dentist for your father, causing bleeding, your father-in-law, what all these different dinim are. It says the Gemara, maybe we should say that chenek is more chamor than skila. Says the Gemara, no. Mida'afke rachmanu le'arusa bas Yisrael, michlal nesua bas Yisrael, mechenek l'skila. Because an arusa who is mizana has a different din of the nesua who is mizana, that she switches from chenek to skila, shma mina, that skila is chamura. And that answers the fourth iteration of Reb Shimon. Let's move on to number 5. We're 10 lines down. Skila chamura misayif. Reb Shimon taught us that skila is more stringent than saif. Shekein nitnel megadev, because we know that skila applies to one who is poshet yado be'ikar. You can see the Gemara shortening itself now because we've done this so many times. Says the Gemara, Adirabba, perhaps we should say saif is chamor. Shekein nitna la'anshe yarni dachas ma'chumer shekein mamonan avad. What's on the scales of justice? On the one side we have poshet yado be'ikar, skila, and on the other side we have shekein mamonan avad ba'yarni dachas, which is saif. So says the Gemara as a response, Amres, here's what we'll say to you. Which one is more powerful? We have to look. Says the Gemara, koach ha-madiach or koach ha-nidach, the one who causes or the one who is caused to. Koach ha-madiach v'kal v'chomer. Uma chenek shechamur misayev skila chamura mimenu. Chenek is a higher level than sayev, but skila is a higher level than chenek. So therefore, saif, which is less than chenek, saif hakal lo kol shekain. And this concludes our 5th nekuda of Reb Shimon. And let's move on to our final one. Then we're going to learn a din of Reb Yochanan, or at least we're going to try to learn a din of Reb Yochanan. And then we will pause 3 lines into the wide lines. Last but not least, to try and understand the sheet of Reb Shimon is a third of the way down. Chenek chamor misaif. According to Reb Shimon, chenek is a greater capital punishment than saif. Why is chenek so bad? As we pointed out already, that perhaps chenek is more severe than saif, because when one is makya avi v'imo, they get chenek. Adarabba, perhaps saif is chamer shekein nitan la'anshe ir hanidachas u'may chomer shekein mamon and avad. Now what we have on the scales is makya avi v'imo on the one side, and that is going to be chenek. And on the other side, we have Saif in a case of Irani Dachas of Shekain Mamon and Avad. So which one is which? So Amras, the Gemara gives the same Svar gave before, halfway down. Koach hamadiach, o koach hanidach. Haveomer koach hamadiach v'tanya, madiche iranidachas beskila, that the people who cause for a city to violate these isurim of avodah zarah, they have a worse punishment. Therefore, skila is more chamor. But what does Reb Shimon hold? Reb Shimon says bechenek, the madichim are chenek. So therefore, he holds, and this was the last piece of our mission that we needed to conclude, is that chenek is chamor, that more chamor than sayef. All of this explains the pecking order that was enumerated in our mission at the top of Mem Testament base. That according to the Tanakama, the order is Skila, Sreifa, Hereg, and Chenek, and to just put them into play, right? Skila is Poshet Yado, Sreifa is Bas Kohen Shezinsa, Hereg is going to be Irani Dachas, and Chenek is going to be Makeh Aviv Imo. And Reb Shimon changes the order ever so slightly: Sreifa Skila, Chenek, and Hereg. Very good. We're right now about halfway down on the page, and on Nunamid Beis, the Gemara says Margala Bepume de Rabbi Yochanan, a beautiful catchphrase, literally translated as there was a pearl that was found in the mouth of Rabbi Yochanan, which means he was regular to say these things. And the Gemara says, Na'ara ha'me'urasa bas kohen shezinsa. If you have a Na'ara ha'me'urasa. Now, we learned about this in Yevamos. A Na'ara is a very slim set of ages, where she is between 12 and 12 and a half years old. And she's me'urasa, she's engaged. And she's a bas kohen. And she's zinsa. So you have a 12-year-old girl, 12 years up to 12 and 6 months, who's engaged and cheats. This is not a normal scenario under any circumstances. What's the halacha? This is a machlokas. Tanakama holds beskila, Reb Shimon Omer bisreifa. Now this makes sense because when we initially learned Reb Shimon an amud ago, we pointed out that the reason why the Tanakama holds skila sreifa and why Reb Shimon holds sreifa skila was because of this nakuda of the arusa who was mizana, that she has a different din. What does Reb Shimon hold over here? L'shitaso b'sreifa. Now look at this. Zinsa me aviha b'skila. What if she was mizana with her father? A case of incest. So the Gemara says the punishment is b'skila. What does Reb Shimon hold? L'shitaso, Reb Shimon says, it's still sreifa. I don't care. Asks the Gemara, my kamash malan. You've taught me literally nothing new. I already knew this. I would have projected even on my own. And I'm an Am Haaretz. I would have said the same exact. That's what you said earlier. That's what you said an Amud ago. On the top, on Nunav and Amud Aleph, you already said this. We know Reb Shimon is a party line. He says that she gets Reifa, Arusa, or Nesua, doesn't matter. Says the Gemara, L'Rabbanan, it's coming to teach us a chiddush about the Rabbanan, that Nesua Yatza L'Sreifa, V'lo Arusa. And that's something we knew already. And the Reb Shimon, achas arusa ve'achas nesua yatza l'sreifa. Reb Yochanan's doubling down on an obvious din. We know it, but he's doubling down. B'tayim amai. Why is it that we hold this way? Because the Gemara says mishum de l'Rabbanan skila chamura and l'Reb Shimon sreifa chamura. And what's the nafkamina? The mishin is chayv shnei misos bezdin nidon bechamura. So look, she's going to be put to death. The whole pecking order of what it is that she, what punishment that she gets, whereas according to the Tanakama, it's skila, and according to Reb Shimon, it's sreifa if she's an arusa. So the Gemara says that we always give the greater punishment. This shmecks a little bit of kamle b'derabba minei, even though it's not really an application of that din. But if a person does need to get punished, and they have two capital punishments that are incumbent upon them, then they should get the greater of the two. My Reb Shimon. What's with Reb Shimon's shita that he holds that the arusa and the nesua are shaykh by sreifa, by the pas kohen shezinsa? So the Gemara says the following: Titania, we have a brisa. Reb Shimon Omer shnei klalos namru bevas kohen. There are two rules that are said about a bas kohen. The Gemara interrupts the brisa. Bevas kohen v'lo bevas Yisrael. You're only going to talk about a kohen. So the Gemara says ema af bevas kohen. V'hotzi akasov nesua michlal nesua. The arusa michlal arusa, and the case of a bas kohen who's an asua, and the case of an arusa who is let me say this again. The case of an Asua who's a Bas Kohen, and the case of an Asua who's a Bas Yisrael, and also the case of an Arusa who's a Bas Kohen and an Arusa who's a Bas Yisrael, they're not the same. Makshek kishahotzi akasav nesua mechlal nesua lahachmir. Akshotzi akasav arusa mechlal arusa lahachmir. So the halacha should be, and this is a very difficult piece of Gemara, but that's what the Gemara means over here, that a Bas Kohen, that she is going to get Sreifa, so too the Arusa, the Nesua and the Arusa have the same din. They have the same exact din. This is Reb Shimon. This is where he gets his shita from. He holds that a Bas Kohen Shezinsa, whether or not she's an Nesua or an Arusa, the halacha is she's going to be considered as Shaykh by Sreifa. And lastly, and this is a very cryptic piece of Gemara, Zomime, the Edim who are Edim Zomimin, Nesua, Zomime Nesua Bas Kohen Bichlal, Zomime Nesua Bas Yisrael. That the Edim Zomimin, who, again, they lied, but they tried to say that the Nesua of a Bas Kohen was Zinsa. She's part of the world of Nesua Bas Yisrael, and again, the Rishonim here point out that this is Bechenek. And V'zomime Arusa Bas Kohen Bichlal, Zomime Arusa Bas Yisrael, that the din there would be also the same din. And that is why Reb Shimon holds what he holds based on this very complex brisa, that a Bas Kohen Shezinsa, whether or not she is an Nesua or an Arusa, she is going to get Sreifa. So we're going to stop right here at the words Tanu Rabbanon. Rabbi Handler will pick up tomorrow night, and he will hopefully only teach one night. I have another night next week that I most likely will not be available. I have to check my schedule. I probably won't be here. But other than that, we're going to stop right here. And I'm wishing you all a beautiful night.